welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a video about books that have influenced my life. I thought I'd do this video just because I'm still new. This is my third video and I thought this would be a good way for you to get to know me more. So all of these books are books that are important to me, either because they influenced my reading journey or they have a connection to someone. So I wanted to share them with you so you could get a better idea of who I am as a reader. These aren't my favorite books per se. I mean, all of them are books that I love, but I think I'm a pretty easy reader to please. I tend to like books with twists, but also like books that are predictable. I like fantasy, romance, historical fiction, sci-fi. I've read a lot of nonfiction lately, along with classics, kids' books too. I tend to be someone who generally likes the books that I pick up, and I finish most of the books I read. I can't remember the last book that I DNF'd. So these aren't a list of my favorites per se. As much as I love all of these books, I think there are other books that I would say are higher on my list of favorites but didn't necessarily make as big of an impact. This list is going to focus on books that are important to me. I'm going to start from kind of my younger years and work my way up through more recent times. So to get started, first book that I remember, kind of my first memory of any book really, is one that my grandma used to read to me, and it is called The Tall Book of Make-Believe by Jane Werner. I actually have this book, but it's at my parents' house still, which about half my books are. So this book, my grandma used to read to me when I would go over to her house, and I would almost beg for this book every time. She had other books that she read to me regularly, but this one was my favorite. So this book is a set of fairy tales, not your normal fairy tales. They're very unique. It was written in like the 1920s, so the artwork, the style of writing is very different from what I would see usually in the books that I had, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Some of my favorite stories were the Gingham Dog and the Calico Cat, about these two stuffed animals that would come to life at night and fight each other. They would just bicker back and forth, and it had I remember there was like a dish and a spoon, you know, kind of like those fairy tale themes. There was another story about a boy who found a magic coin and used it to buy a lollipop, the biggest lollipop in the candy store, and it was a long-lasting lollipop, and it turned out that this lollipop continued to just get bigger and bigger, and it ended up lasting like his entire life, and he didn't know what to do with it. It just kept getting bigger, and I think eventually he planted it in his backyard almost like a tree, and I just loved the idea of that as a kid. So there were a lot of great fairy tales with just amazingly beautiful artwork, which I didn't necessarily appreciate as a kid, but looking back on it and enjoying that book now, it's definitely something I love. When I was in maybe middle school, my grandma actually gave this book to my aunt, who also loved this book growing up, and I was pretty disappointed. And I found out that they had stopped making this book and it was pretty expensive to get, but my parents actually gave it to me as part of a graduation gift. Another book that was important to me when I was younger was The Ice Cream Shop by Dennis Lee. It was another book that I would beg for over and over again, and my dad and my mom would read it to me a lot of the times. It was another poetry book, and these were really silly poems. Some of them were kind of like more calming, but most of them had a lot of alliteration and were just absolute nonsense, and I loved it. There was one about a kid who was trying to sing happy birthday, but he was so nervous that his thoughts were mixed up. And so the whole poem is him like mixing up words. There was another poem about them digging a hole to Australia to meet kids on the other side. And then every once in a while they'd have a poem about a kid with a specific name and just like rhymes with those names. There were just so many great and hilarious poems that I absolutely loved. And they also, like I said, had some nice ones. They had some about, you know, bedtime and that kind of stuff that we would read at the end. He would read a few of the silly ones and then finish off with those bedtime ones, which I always just absolutely loved. And it was a great way for us to kind of connect. Another book that was important to me in my early years was the collection of poems written by Shel Silverstein. So I have a lot of his books on my shelf. I think I have almost every book he's ever written. A lot of his poetry was some of my favorite to read. It was some of the first stuff that I actually started reading on my own. My parents weren't reading it to me, or we weren't reading it together in school. It was something that I had picked out for myself, which was important. And it was also the first collection from an author that I had. I realized that if I liked one book by an author, I could go and find more from that same person. And so I think for a while during first grade, all I read was Shel Silverstein, and I just kept picking up different books from him and really diving into those. And I kept that love of Shel Silverstein with me. I still love him, but I remember doing projects based on his writing up through elementary school and kind of doing a lot of book reports on his stuff during my early years. His artwork was just something that was a little bit different, and I really always loved that kind of obscure and slightly strange kind of artwork. I was, growing up as a kid, a huge fan of Tim Burton and the Far Side comics. Yeah, I think it's Far Side. Just strange and out there and a little bit more gloomy, I guess. Shel Silverstein's artwork was just a little bit more bizarre, and for whatever reason, I was really drawn to that. Around that same time, those early first and second grade years of elementary school, I picked up my first series, Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is actually my mom's book, and she gave it to me. She wrote her name in the front, and she got it in 6th grade. It was important to me not because it was my mom's book that she had given to me, but also because I connected to this story. I grew up in Kansas, middle of nowhere, small town. I know I've said that before, but the setting of these books really drew me in right off the bat, and it was the first series that I read on my own. Actually, the first series I read. I don't think my parents ever read a series of books to me. So this was the first series that I ever read, and I fell in love with them, burned through them pretty quickly. I remember getting to some of the bigger ones and having to ask special permission to go to the higher grade level bookshelves. They weren't necessarily first or second grade level books, but I was struggling through them and pushing myself to get through them because I just absolutely adored the storyline. So, Little House on the Prairie, my first series, huge turning point for me because I ended up falling in love with the idea of series and reading series. I prefer a series to a standalone. Towards the upper end of elementary, around 4th or 5th grade, I started really getting into reading. I was going to the library as much as possible. I would find any and all excuses to read, and I started staying up late to read, reading when I was supposed to have my lights out, and that kind of lifestyle. And one of the books that I remember loving so much was The Phantom Tollbooth. I read an excerpt of this in school in 4th grade. I think we read like the first 2 chapters. It was kind of my dive into bigger books and fantasy. I loved the storyline, the adventure that they went on, the connection I could make to things in my world, like the dodecahedron, the guy with the dodecahedron for a face, and I remember going to look up what a dodecahedron was and kind of relating that. The princesses, Rhyme and Reason, I thought were just the coolest people ever, and the doldrums was just such a fun concept to me. So this really was my first fantasy novel. It was also one of the first books that we read in school that I took time to go find and buy. A lot of the books that we'd read before that I hadn't really made as big of a connection with. I always enjoyed them because, again, I'm a pretty easy to please reader, but this is the first one that I remember writing down in my planner and being like, okay, I need to go buy this book. I want to read the full book. In that same year, I also found My Side of the Mountain. The idea of a kid going off to live on his own, and again kind of having this adventure and tying in the survival factor of it, just kind of blew my mind. I had never really thought about going off to live on my own or what that would be like or how I would survive. And this was really the first of a survival book that I read. I went on to read things like Hatchet and enjoyed those just as much, but this was kind of my introduction to that survival, which eventually turned into a love of dystopian and apocalyptic, just that how would you survive kind of feel. And in this book, he goes and finds a hollowed out tree, and I spent about 2 years, and I spent about a year after this book looking for trees that would be big enough for me to hollow out. I also tried to make a house out of mud in the backyard when I realized that none of the trees in Kansas are big enough for this kind of adventure that he was having, and eventually gave up on that. It also affected my real life in that I got more into camping. I wanted to learn how to make a fire. I wanted to learn how to find my own food. I learned more about the plant life around me. And in general, it influenced not just my reading life, but also my real life. So there was that. And then around that 5th grade year, we get to one of my all-time favorites, along with most people here on BookTube, and a huge influence on my life, and that is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So my book, this one, I don't actually have the cover on it. I went through a phase where I took all the covers off my books because they were annoying, and I kind of regret that now because some of my books that had just beautiful covers don't have anymore. But this book, of course, is life-changing the same way it was for a lot of readers. It made me feel like part of a community. I stayed up all night and would read these books in one sitting, and that was the first time I'd really done that. I remember midnight premieres, which was another concept that was new to me, and just the community that this introduced to my life and the continual love and impact and magic that it has brought to my life. I mean, I started reading this in 5th grade when it first came out, and I still, to this day, have an extreme love of anything Harry Potter. We all know how lasting, how magical this story is, and so there's no way I could not put it on my list. Once I started to get a little bit older, I started to read more fantasy, and I would always try and share those books with my younger brother and sister because I wanted someone to talk about these books to, and at that time I just didn't have a community that I do now, which makes sense. I was in like middle school and high school. A lot of the times my sister was too young to read the books that I was reading or enjoying. My brother had a very different take on reading. He wasn't as big of a reader, and he tended not to enjoy fantasy as much as I did because he didn't like the fact that it seemed to be made up and you could make your own rules and just kind of fit whatever worked for you as an author, which is understandable. It wasn't his style of thinking, and it wasn't his style of reading. And so a lot of times I would be disappointed because I'd be so excited to share this book with him, and he just wasn't into it. He liked more biographies, nonfiction, historical, those kind of things, and I did not connect to those as a kid at all. So this book, Tomorrow When the War Began, by John Marston, is a series that I found in middle school, high school, and I shared it with him, and he also loved it. So it was the first book and series that my brother and I both enjoyed, and we read through it very quickly. We got to talk about all of the books together. It's about a group of kids that go on a hike down into kind of like this canyon, and when they come back out about a week later, they realize that their country, which is Australia, has been taken over, and kind of their tactics, how they turn into almost this guerrilla war group. So it was a good mix of that survival and fantasy adventure that I love, and the war and strategy books that he loved. It didn't have any magic, so there didn't seem to be any made-up systems that would usually turn him off from a book. Another book that impacted more of my reading journey than my life itself or connect me to a person was The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. The book was the first dystopian or apocalyptic book that I had ever read, and it immediately sparked my love of that. I then went on to buy about 6 or 7 other series that were in a similar style. Everything from Maze Runner to Divergent to Under the Evernight. Everything that I read past this for about 3 years was because I read Hunger Games. A friend at one of my summer camps recommended the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkin. This is the first epic series that I've ever read. I think there are 15 books total. I actually stopped at like 12 or 13 because that's kind of the unofficial ending, and most people that I talked to said that that was the best place to end the series because it kind of wrapped it up nicely, and where it almost seems like the other books were an afterthought. Like I said, I haven't read those, so I don't really know. But this was the first epic fantasy that I read. It is actually a pretty controversial book. I didn't realize this until about 6 months ago when I was going to go back and start rereading them and kind of looking to see, since I had found BookTube, what BookTube thought of this book. And a lot of people like it, but there is, I guess, some similarities, or people would say almost stolen from the Wheel of Time series, which I've never read. So I still enjoyed this, and it is a huge part of my reading experience because it was the first epic fantasy that I read. And after this, I went on to read, actually, The Lord of the Rings for the first time, along with Game of Thrones. It made me feel like I was capable of reading these giant book series that I had always kind of shied away from. I had stuck with trilogies or duologies. I think the most I'd ever read in a series before this was Harry Potter when I was younger and kind of had time as each book came out. And these were already all, I had to work my way through them. I felt just a lot of success as a reader as I went through this, and I was excited to continue to pick up more epic fantasies. The last book on my list is one that I read with one of my college lit courses, and that is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. I'm actually rereading with my reading group right now. This book was one of those books that just stuck with me in a way a lot of books haven't. It's one that if I have to choose a book that is my favorite or a book to recommend, this is one of my go-to, which I think is saying something for me as someone who just loves reading and is easily influenced as far as favorites. This book has always been towards the top of that list since I've read it. The writing style was new to me. Just the way that Markus Zusak wrote in this book was something I had never seen before, and just seemed so beautiful. Not only that, but the story was so touching and engaging and just well written that I couldn't help but fall in love with it. So I think that was a big thing for me because up until that, a lot of the writing styles that I had been reading had been similar, and this was a completely different format from what I'd ever read before. And it started getting me thinking about what I was reading more and how they were writing as an author and what I wanted as a reader. And it just, like I said, is an absolutely beautiful story. So that is a list of books that have kind of changed me or connected me throughout my lifetime. There are obviously way more books that I could add to my list, but these were the ones that kind of stood out throughout my reading journey from a young age to closer to where I'm at now. There's a lot of books that I've loved, but these books have been some of the most important books in my reading career. So I would love to hear some of your major books, books that either changed your reading, inspired you to read a new genre, connected you to a reader, connected you as a family, just any books that you would say impacted your life as a reader and just impacted your life in general. Let me know in the comments down below. I love to look through your important reads. Bye-bye!